What I'm going to look at is an English learning program and thinking about how that program can be a little bit wider than merely the language, the linguistic, the pragmatic side. And I'm suggesting that this may be the responsibility of curriculum planners, it may be the responsibility of the teachers to go beyond the language, and I'll try to justify that argument as I go through. First of all, let us look at what the commonly assumed purposes for learning English are. First of all, within a context which I would assume is at least partially relevant in Japan, if there are speakers of other languages who don't understand because they don't have a language in common, then English is used as that language in common. So that might be one purpose with which learners can identify. That would be the case within parts of the United Kingdom, but not very frequently. It would also be the case that learning English, and this would certainly be the case in Britain for learning a foreign language, that the more languages you know, even at a very rudimentary and elementary level, the better your chances of getting a good job. In other words, it's a condition of job opportunity that you speak and have a little bit of competence in another language. It's certainly, English is certainly across Europe seen as a social advantage. If you can speak English, then there's something that you have which other people would like to have. In other words, it is an advantage in that sense. It has a high status, the ability to speak the language. Now, whether you want to agree with those or not is the premise on which I'm going to devise and develop the argument, because I think we ought to go beyond those pragmatic reasons, objectives for learning English. What I would argue is that it is for the language teacher to make quite apparent that those sorts of justifications for learning English are merely a part of the picture. Motivation should be, in my view, wider than the instrumental, wider than the pragmatic. Why? Because when you learn English, and I think it's teachers who are aware of this, who develop the idea with their learners, it develops an awareness not just of the language they're learning, of English, but actually of language learning skills. And I think that's really important if we're going to aim at some kind of plurilinguistic autonomous learner at the end of the day. What are then the language skills, the language awareness which are developed? And I think this is where we need to spend a little bit more time to reflect about it, because what is language learning other than some kind of understanding about the way that language functions? And the way that language functions can be made aware to, learners can be made aware of that kind of function of the English language that they're learning. English is one amongst many other languages. And the features of English that they're learning aren't just features which apply to English. They are features which apply to all languages. And just to, and I'm a teacher trainer, and my students are training to teach French. And they discover when they talk to pupils in school and learners in higher parts of educational system, that they don't always understand that grammar works across languages. And there could be, or there are, features in common from one language to another. In other words, it's not just the peculiarity of one language that the grammar is as it is. There are features across languages which can be made the source of comparisons, and I think that's really important. In other words, there is also the language of subject-specific knowledge which comes into play in order that you understand what's going on. If you are talking to a car mechanic, and he's interested in, or she is interested in, the mechanics of a car, there's the subject knowledge which is necessary, no matter what your foreign language is, which will enable you to learn and to cope with the other language. So the understanding and using has that area where you already have knowledge which is available to you and which can be exploited as far as you want and as far as you are able to. And they don't always realize that they have knowledge. Learners need to know they have knowledge which can help them in the language learning process. In other words, there are parts of life which can be brought to bear to develop communication skills. Some of the learners that we have don't believe that anything they know has any kind of relevance to what they are learning to do in the foreign language. And I think if we can show them through the situations in which we put them when they're learning the language, that this is something they already have. There is a cultural convention which exists in their native language and in the language that they're learning, which they need to get into and to make comparisons, and indeed to discover that there is a curiosity that can be aroused by that kind of awareness. In other words, the world of the origin and the world of the target community can be compared. That's one of the recommendations that the framework would make, except that the framework doesn't really make recommendations. It asks you to reflect upon and think about, is this a possibility within your language learning program? If you can talk about where you come from and who you are, and you can compare that with the world of the target language community, well then there's a kind of broadening of one's education in those terms. And the comparisons are not just comparisons between language, but comparisons between culture, which are absolutely vital for any kind of language learning to take place. In other words, within our program of teaching English, it may be possible and should be really, I think, almost mandatory to make those kind of comparisons so that one's own identity is actually put into question somewhat in terms of the identity of the community whose language we're learning. In other words, we've got language learning strategies which are developed through the learning of one language, which can be reapplied to the learning of other languages. And this is using the terminology from the Common European Framework, the competence, which is called their savoir, être. And I think that's the beginnings of the savoir, which ought to be opened up and made explicit for all the learners with whom we're responsible. And then the interaction that happens in language terms, when do we take the initiative? When do we take within the language activities that we are engaged in class, when do we take the initiative? When do we ask for help? When do we request repetition? In other words, we do that in our own native language. How do you do that in the other language? In other words, there's a generality of linguistic competence which you have in your own home language, which ought to be and can be reapplied to that the language that you're learning. And in English, I think if we can emphasize what aspects of language in English learning can be compared to the way that we do it within our own native tongue, it makes the learners come aware that actually learning English is not such a strange thing, because it's something that they do in their own language, but they're not always aware that there are comparisons that they can make and actually discover that that's something which is quite important. It's not so odd to be learning English. It's not so odd to be English. And being English is really quite important. Similarly, if we look at learning English as a foreign language, there are patterns within English as there are patterns in their home language. And to make them aware of patterns is surely what we're doing most of the time, both in terms of speaking and reading and grammatical patterns, and that's something which I believe ought to be made explicit by the teacher of English within a school or university setting, that these patterns are important in order for us to become better at and more aware of how we learn foreign languages. And indeed, if the patterns are significant ones, then I think they can see, the learners can see, that there's a way that they can apply what they're doing within their language learning programs, in this instance English, to any other language. In other words, if we get used to looking for patterns, we can find them, and if we can find them and to recognize that they exist, then we become a better language learner. Similarly, languages are systematic. That is extremely difficult for beginning learners. I discovered that trying to discover how some of the patterns work in Japanese. I haven't found any yet because I'm only a beginning learner. But I'm looking for them in order that I can get better. And to look for patterns is surely the case of what we do when we're teaching English as a foreign language. We try to make our learners quite aware of where the patterns exist. Is it a pattern which can be reapplied? If it is, well then let's see how we can reapply it and become effective and efficient learners in turn. That enables us to establish some rules for what we're doing. It's not completely haphazard, this language that we're learning. If teachers who are teaching English can make the learners aware that what it is they are doing when they're learning English is pattern recognition, is system recognition, in order that rules can be understood and formulated, then I think we're getting better at showing our learners how to become more effective language learners. In other words, within just the framework of learning English, there are all sorts of other more general skills which we are developing. But it's not just, in my view, the job of the teacher just to teach the language. The job of the teacher goes beyond that. The job of the teacher is to show how to learn. Not just English, but how to learn within a language framework. And how to learn is really quite, I think it's quite a productive way of teachers approaching the topic for the groups that they have in front of them. And in teaching somebody and showing, demonstrating, and making explicit how to learn, we're giving them more new experiences in terms of language learning skills, and we're giving them experiences which are productive ones in terms of their ability to see how what it is they're learning in their English classes can be reapplied to other languages, and indeed can help them make comparisons between not just English but their own native tongue. So new knowledge, and that's what we're about, new knowledge is what we're trying to marry into and put into existing knowledge. They all have their own native tongue. They don't all have the ability to analyze their own native tongue and see how it works, and I think that's something we're trying to do, is put the two together. And we're also trying to encourage a willingness on the part of the learners to think about how their own language works. They haven't always done that. Most of our learners in school in Britain have never thought about their own language and how it works. And if you're learning a foreign language, I would say that's the first time they've been made and encouraged to think about their own language by making comparisons between the language and the language that they're learning. And also they realize that learning a foreign language develops a number of skills which are quite important ones. How do I memorize? What is it that I have to do in order to memorize different parts of language? Is it better, more effective for me to memorize language as isolated words in a list, which we may set them for homework? Is it better for me to memorize language when it occurs in a context? How do I do it? How do I do it anyway? How do I do it in my native tongue? How do I do it in my foreign language? These are all different forms of learning how to learn. And when I'm being given some text from my teacher, how can I select what it is that I'm making of that text? Is it going to be me, the learner, developing skills within that framework of memorization, or is it going to be me, the teacher, encouraging me to develop those sorts of skills? And it may be a question which the teacher ought to ask themselves: where do the texts come from? What sorts of texts are they? Are they contrived texts in order to merely illustrate a grammatical pattern or lexis, or do they have a more authentic use? So there is that element of learning English. The other element of learning English, which I think is one to be developed, is that of social interaction. When we have our class in front of us, do we as the teacher engage with them as learners in terms of establishing relationships? Probably. Do we also engage them in working with other speakers of English beyond the classroom? It's a question I need to ask you because I don't know the answer to that in your context. But when we are, for example, teaching French, we are trying to engage the people in front of us in a collaborative project so that we can share beliefs. I don't know what French children, teenagers, older learners believe in, nor do the class in front of me who are learning their language. Do we get our learners of English to share our beliefs, their beliefs, with the target language community elsewhere, other than in front of us? I believe sometimes we don't. We don't make enough of that, and I think that could be really quite important. Because after all, what it is, why are we teaching them this language? They're going to use it. What for? In other words, the objectives are wider than just using language. They're to get to know people, to operate with them, to communicate with them. All the people with whom their communication have got different personalities. Some of them are tolerant, some of them are intolerant. We need to be able to recognize this and to respond to it appropriately. In other words, teachers, I believe, need to set performance objectives which help our learners think about, reflect on, and identify what they can do, not just in language terms, but what they can do in terms of the language that they're learning in social interaction and with other people. The other people is for them and us to define and to be clear about. There's no point in learning French for my group unless they're going to talk to some French people. Who are the French people going to be? Can we engineer it that they get into some kind of contact with the learners? In other words, if they're going to do that, what skills do they need? What language do they need to acquire? And what targets are they going to set themselves in order that some kind of communication takes place? And in order to do that, of course, we've got to get a kind of ethos amongst our learners that they need to be able to assess themselves. It's not just a reliance on the assessment of that others bring to their language and cultural awareness competence. It's the assessment that they can make of themselves in order that they set targets which are appropriate and personal to them. And we've been using various tools and instruments to enable and to encourage learners to think about, what can I do with this language that I'm being taught? What can I do with this language that I'm in the middle of learning? So, why learn English? Well then, perhaps the why learn English needs to be fairly broad and needs to be made explicit. And those elements of being explicit are to work with other people, and we know who those other people are. In other words, we are aware who the audience and the readership of what we're doing. I don't write letters to send letters to myself. I write letters to send to somebody else who wants to read them. We have a purpose and a readership. We also want to encourage a cultural awareness. Who are these other people with whom we're communicating? Who and what do they think of and believe in? What is their identity? We're making links between language and culture. We're encouraging a curiosity about other people. And what I'm trying to encourage is some kind of collaborative work between learners in my own country and learners in my own country with learners in another country. English as the sole means of communication, I think, ought to be exemplified to show its worth. And that would perhaps show that other countries and other links to other countries are important and can in fact only happen if English is the language they understand. If that is their understanding, well then they think, well, there's a use to English which is not just linguistic, but it's cultural as well. Because lingua franca enables me to approach the culture of other people and to get a little bit more of an understanding of who those other people are. I will therefore get exposure to other languages and to other communities. And that probably is going to be in terms of a very short experience of learning other languages. We have groups who are 18 who only have 3 days to do this kind of exploration, but those 3 days are spent learning for 1 day a little bit about a culture of another country. And part of that is linked into learning a little bit of that language during the first day, a little bit more culture and language on the second day, and a little bit more culture and language on the third day. And then they begin to make comparisons. And this happens 6 times within a 2-year period for all learners in one particular establishment. And that, I think, is a way of exploring language and culture and the links between language and culture and the difference in the similarities. There are not just differences, there are lots of similarities, there are lots of patterns. And I'm arguing, therefore, that these examples of savoir, which is knowledge, and skills, savoir faire, I can do, and existential competence, savoir être, and the ability to learn, savoir apprendre, can come from this kind of experience and should be the job of an English teacher to promote within the groups they're teaching. And I think that's, in short, a way of saying that English is just one system amongst many others, and it ought to be made explicit and understood as such. Thank you very much for listening.